on today's Story Beat.
Start wherever you can start, like I started in the mailroom.
Mm-hmm.
And just keep advancing and do your job well, learn your job and keep advancing. Don't do everything for money. Try and, build your reputation. The other thing she said was aim for success, not money. If you're successful, the money will follow.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, theatrical producer, talent manager, and press agent, Alan Eichler, has represented or produced numerous stage productions, including The Dirtiest Show in Town, Women Behind Bars, The Neon Woman, Timbuktu, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, and Dreamgirls. He's worked with numerous luminaries of theater and music like Tom Eyen, Charles Ludlam, Geraldine Fitzgerald, Eartha Kitt, Melba Moore, The Rolling Stones, Paul Anka, Bobby Vinton, Edie Adams, Peggy Lee, Anita O'Day, Johnnie Ray, Lavern Baker, and Yma Sumac, among many others. Alan represented Jerry Rubin's book, Growing Up at 37, and also worked closely with the late great playwright Terrence McNally on such plays as The Ritz, Where Has Tommy Flowers Gone, Next, and Bad Habits. Alan currently promotes legendary jazz harpist-pianist Corky Hale. In 1994, Alan produced an original musical, Swanson on Sunset, about the attempts of Gloria Swanson to create a stage musical out of Sunset Boulevard as a vehicle for herself. Alan nurtured that project for many years, and now the film Boulevard, A Hollywood Story, has finally reached fruition. Jeffrey Schwartz's brilliant documentary traces Gloria Swanson's ill-fated efforts as she joined forces with two gay writers who assisted her. The show was nearly produced before it all fell apart, which is the story at the heart of the documentary. So for all those exceptional reasons and many more, I'm honored to welcome the multi-talented Alan Eichler to StoryBeat today. Alan, welcome to StoryBeat.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you, believe me. So let's go back to the very beginning. Where did all of this creativity for you in the world of show business come from? Where did you first start thinking about show business? At what age?
Probably very young. Although I never knew where I would fit in. My grandfather had a record store.
Mm-hmm.
And he would take me to the store with him on Saturdays when they didn't have school, and I'd sit behind the counter and wait on people when I was a kid, a child.
Sure.
Anyway, I started collecting records very early, before I could even read, because I couldn't read what the records were, but I knew the labels. I could identify the labels, so I knew what I was playing.
Right.
And my favorite, I'm trying to give you an abbreviated version.
Sure.
My favorite turned out to be Patti Page.
Mm.
And this is very early, around the time of Doggy in the Window. And I started collecting. I liked the way she sounded. I didn't really know who she was. I started collecting her records. And that led to me being a record collector, which I still am. I have a huge collection, thousands of records.
Wow.
And in 1957, she had an hour-long TV show, and this is one of my funny stories. And hopefully it's funny. I knew that her manager had an office. I thought of it as her office. I knew there was an office anyway in Rockefeller Center, and I found the address, and I took the subway into the city. I lived in Queens. I went into Manhattan and found the office, and it was a huge building in Rockefeller Center on the 12th floor with banks of elevators on each side. Yeah, I had fantasized about Patti Page now for about 5 years at that point.
Right.
I had Patti Page coloring books, paper dolls.
Wow.
Scrapbooks. I mean, everything. But anything that had Patti Page, I was collecting. My family all made fun of me because of it. All my relatives knew, my aunts and uncles and cousins, they all knew about my Patti Page infatuation. Anyway, the elevator doors opened, and there standing in front of me in a full-length mink coat and fully made up was Patti Page.
Oh, wow.
Getting onto the elevator across from me. And the elevator doors opened just long enough for me to see her before she got into her elevator and the doors closed.
Right.
Think about the timing of that. I mean,
well, the odds are huge.
Whatever you believe in, I mean, for that to happen, you know, can imagine how I reacted. I went into the office and she had a secretary it was actually her manager's office. And there was a secretary who was devoted just to the fans. That was her main job. Because Patti at that time was the #1 singer in the country. So you have to imagine her being a superstar at that point.
Of course.
And the show was an hour-long color show on CBS, their first color show. Anyway, the secretary gave me tickets. I started going every week. Eventually, I had my own reserved seat, and I was allowed to go to the dress rehearsals, which had no audience. And I could go to the dress rehearsals and basically go up to any of the stars that I wanted to and talk to them or get their autographs, which is really unheard of. I was 13, and they were letting me roam the studio during rehearsal.
Well, that certainly wouldn't happen today, would it?
Not at all. And so after school, it was every Wednesday, the show was live. I would go into the city and go to the rehearsal, get something to eat, and then go in for the broadcast. And I met all these big stars who at the time I was getting their autographs, but several of them later turned out to be clients, which is another bizarre thing.
Well, it sounds like it was kismet. You know, you were meant to do that.
And I still have the autographs. And that gave me the first sense of show business. And I always loved theater and loved everything, but I knew I wasn't an actor, and I really didn't know what else there was.
So you didn't feel like you had any stage talent or acting abilities?
No, I was majoring when I went to I was in junior high school then, middle school. When I went to high school and college, I just went to a community college for 2 years. I majored in English, and I was going to be an English teacher at one point.
Mm-hmm.
And I was accepted to a teacher's college, which I was going to go to after the community college. Again, it's kind of fate. And the summer, I finished my 2 years at the local community college, living at home. And it was really like an extension of high school. I hated it. But, well, there was no sense of college. There was no campus. It was Nassau Community College on Long Island. They didn't have their own building yet. So they were operating out of a courthouse in Mineola.
Oh, okay.
And so there was it was just getting up early, going to classes and coming home. There was no sense of, what college life would be normally.
It felt not like an official school.
Right. But I got a part-time job. We had the only Cinerama theater. I went to Syosset High School. We had the only Cinerama theater outside of Manhattan, called the Syosset Theater, which was a reserved seat roadshow house, which was very theatrical. Roadshow movies, for those that don't know, played like a play. I mean, they gave one show a night with matinees, maybe on the weekend, a Wednesday matinee in this case as well. And it was reserved seats, and we had ushers, and I was the ticket taker. I had to wear a tuxedo, which was, it was like putting on a uniform. I wore a tuxedo and stood at the door and took tickets. And then while the movie was on, they usually had intermission. So the first half of the movie, I'd have to clean up the candy stand and go clean up the bathroom, mop the floors in the bathroom.
But you were in show business.
Exactly. It was very theatrical to me. I loved it.
What's that old famous story about the guy that follows the elephants around at the circus to clean up after the elephants?
That's I really felt it was show business. But I was still planning to continue to teachers college, and just about a month before I finished the 2 years, and it was like August of this, where I was going to start in September. And up in Fredonia, New York, a town I'd never heard of, but they had a state teachers college, and they accepted me.
Made famous in duck soup.
I know. Fredonia, I know it sounds like that. My brother, who was 4 years younger than me, he was interested in the technical side of theater. He wanted to be a lighting designer and or set designer, lighting designer primarily. And he brought home a book called something like "So You Want to Be in the Theater," and it had a chapter on each of the different jobs that you could do in the theater. And I started going through it, and there was a chapter on press agents. Today they say publicists, but back then it was press agent.
Right.
And the last chapter in the book was on press agents, and the last line of the chapter was something like, if you're good in English and you love the theater, then being a theatrical press agent could be the answer to your dream. So it was like a light bulb went off. And I said, oh, I'll be a theatrical press agent. So I went through I went through the yellow pages and all of my old playbills and made a list of all the theatrical press agents in Manhattan.
Right.
They were all kind of in the theater district. So it was easy to go into the city and go from office to office, which is basically what I did. I had no contacts. I didn't know anybody.
You were cold calling.
Right. I literally walked into each office saying I wanted, the chapter said you had to apprentice for the union.
Right.
So I walked into each office asking to be an apprentice. This is how little I knew. And they were all different. Some of them were very small, like back then, a lot of the old theaters had offices upstairs. And one of them was this legendary old press agent named Richard Maney, who kind of went back to the days of George Jean Nathan and Brooks Atkinson. And
wow, that's way back.
He was reviewing like in the 20s and 30s. And the last big thing he had done was My Fair Lady, but this was the mid 60s, and he was just this old man sitting behind a desk. He had nobody working for him. But I walked into his office, and it was kind of like seeing Miss Haversham. It was like, I don't think there really were cobwebs, but it had that kind of feeling. It was dark, very dark, and he was all the way against the back wall behind a desk. And of course, he didn't need anybody. And I went to another office that turned out to be the husband of the woman who had written the book.
Okay.
Another strange coincidence. His partner was Saul Jacobson. They were doing Fiddler on the Roof at the time, so they were kind of hot. And they didn't need anybody, but they suggested I go to another office, Salters O'Rourke and Sabinson, which was a very big office. So I went there, and they hired me for the mailroom for $55 a week. But
back then, $55 a week, you could kind of live on that, couldn't you?
Well, yeah, I was still living at home.
And that helped.
It would have been a stretch even then, but I was still living at home, so I took the train in every day, which was 2 hours back and forth.
Oof, wow.
And but I loved it, and they hired me knowing that I wanted to be a press agent. So I guess that I always thought of them as teaching me, but I guess they did. My boss started giving me more and more things to do, and more responsibilities.
So was this Lee Salters?
Yes, it was Lee Salters and Harvey Sabinson, who went on to be the head of the League of Theatrical Producers.
In a very odd coincidence, Lee Salters for a time in the 1980s represented Jekyll and Hyde while I was working on it.
Oh, okay.
So I have never actually met him. I never met him, but I certainly benefited from his ability.
Then he was working out of Los Angeles, I think.
I think so.
Yeah.
So what fundamentally important things did you learn from them? What were the fundamental bases
back then we had 7 newspapers. Still
in New York.
In New York, we had 7 major newspapers, 4 morning papers, and 3 in the afternoon.
Right.
And we had all the columnists. All the old columnists were still writing: Walter Winchell, Dorothy Kilgallen, Earl Wilson, Leonard Lyons. And
For the listeners that don't know those names, these were very powerful writers in the newspapers that would talk about people in the business, and they could move careers, basically. Correct?
yes, when I came in in the morning, the morning papers were already there, but lunchtime I'd have to go out and get the afternoon papers and bring those in and hand them out to everybody. And there was a woman there named Lillian Picard, who since passed away. She's interesting because she was married to Jerry Kushnick. This might be trivia to most people. She was married to Jerry Kushnick, whose second wife was Helen Kushnick, the notorious manager of Jay Leno, who almost got him fired from NBC.
Right.
Anyway, Lillian was one of the main people who trained me. Part of her job, she had several clients, but part of her job was doing the clips, which was reading all 7 newspapers cover to cover, including the sports sections, looking for any mention of any of the clients. Now, don't ask me how she managed to do that every day and still do her publicity work, but she did. Think of reading 7 newspapers every day, cover to cover.
Unbelievably hard to do.
Looking for a mention of, we had like 30 or 40 clients, looking for any of the mentions, unbelievable. This was the biggest office in New York. We had all the David Merrick shows, all the Neil Simon plays.
All right. So for those that don't understand how this works, what does a press agent do? What does a publicist do? What is the job?
Publicity, a lot of people mix it up with advertising. Advertising is paid for. They're both promotion, but advertising is paid for.
Right.
You buy your space and you write an ad, create an ad or a TV spot or whatever. Publicity is trying to get free coverage.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to try and get the newspapers or the columnists to write about your client, or a TV show or radio show to interview somebody.
So is it all about relationships?
Yes, you develop relationships with these people. Working for a large company like I did, it's easier because it's not Alan Eichler calling, it's Salters calling.
Well, of course, if you're working for Walt Disney and you call as someone
Correct.
working for Walt Disney, it's a lot easier.
Or William Morris or ICM.
Right.
You
Much
become
easier.
the identity. You become the identity of the company that you're
Of
working
course.
for. Anyway, they started training me on the clips, and then I became responsible for tearing out the pages, or we didn't have Xerox yet, so we had what was called a thermofax, which crinkly orange paper that you'd put everything, you'd run it through the machine and it would create this orange, almost like carbon paper, but it was orange, and it would have the image of the clipping. Anyway, then I'd have to mail the clips out to the different clients and their managers and their agents or whoever. Then he taught me to do rerouting, which was another interesting aspect. He had a system they made carbons. Again, we didn't have Xerox, so they made carbon copies of all the column items that went out. And after a certain amount of time, if they weren't printed, they were rerouted to another columnist, and they were rewritten to fit. So you took a Dorothy Kilgallen item and you rewrote it to fit Walter Winchell's, because each of them had their own style.
Sure.
So my next job was cutting up the carbons into strips and having them ready to be rerouted, sorting them out. Then he advanced me eventually to being a press agent. I had my own desk, and he started giving me clients.
And when you had the clients, you were then trying to get them placed into various articles, right?
Yes, the way he had a very large client list. Well, Harvey Sabinson had the theater office. He had an office where they all did the shows, and there were like 3 or 4 press agents working under him, but they all just worked on theater. I worked under Lee, and I was apprenticing for Harvey, but my job was really under Lee Salters. And So we had each press agent was assigned a certain number of clients. And because I was new, he gave me, well, I don't know why he gave me, but the first ones he assigned me to were Edie Adams and the Hollywood Palace TV show. And then we had several stock theaters. So he gave me the Mineola Theater and the Westport Playhouse and the Paper Mill Playhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And in the winter, I had the Palm Beach, the Royal Poinciana Theater in Palm Beach. So those were the first clients that I had. Then I guess because I was young, he gave me Bobby Vinton and Paul Anka and the Rolling Stones. And
well, those are some big acts.
Yeah, but nobody thought of, I don't know. I was just a beginner, but he gave them to me. And I had a secretary that I shared with somebody else. And
I guess he figured sink or swim, trial by fire.
I know I wasn't really into rock and roll, which was the funny thing. I was into old movie stars and old singers. So I was very comfortable with Edie Adams. And I handled the Peggy Lee engagement. I was good with that. And I loved working with Peggy Lee. That was interesting. And I loved Edie. I don't know what they thought of me because I was 19 when I started, fresh out of, besides Skip.
The question, Alan, is were you actually getting them placement? Were you doing good work for them?
Oh, I was very good at what I did.
So then they loved you.
I had no social life at all. I was totally dedicated to my work.
Mm-hmm.
And just before they made me a press agent, they started sending me out to cover things. Because back then, if somebody was coming to a show late at night, coming to a show at night, and they were going to go backstage after the show and be photographed, somebody had to be there. So, and the senior press agents really didn't want to have to cover it. It was old hat to them, and they didn't want to have to be out at 11 o'clock at night. The shows back then started at 8:30 still. 8:40. So anyway, I was willing to do it. I was eager to do anything. So I was like, maybe I was still 19 or 20. And I was covering Ginger Rogers at Hello Dolly, being photographed with whoever it was. And that was, a thrill for me. I'd never done anything like that before.
It must have been very heady at 19.
I don't know what they thought of me, that, I must have seemed like a real kid to them.
Well, you probably did. But again, I think as long as you were delivering the goods, they were perfectly happy.
Oh, exactly. And Ginger was, they all had their quirks. I learned later that a lot of the older stars would make a photographer get up on a chair and shoot down because it covered their neck or their chin line.
Sure.
That's an old Lillian Gish trick. Actually,
that's a neat trick for anybody thinking about it today.
I've heard Lillian Gish talk about that in interviews. Anyway, Ginger, there was a staircase outside her dressing room. She made the photographers go up to the top of the stairs and shoot down. And I covered, parties late at night. And I learned, this is like old time show business. It doesn't exist anymore like this. The AP office was open all night. And when you had pictures taken at an opening or a party or somebody at the theater, you could take the roll of film. You could have the photographer give you the roll of film. You could take it up to the AP office at Rockefeller Center, and they would develop it while you waited. And if they saw a picture that they wanted to use, they'd print it, and you'd sit at a typewriter and type the caption for it. And I learned to do it. It was really fascinating for me, even though it was like, 1 or 2 in the morning. And so that was another thing I learned. Years later, when I would be in New York covering something, I tried doing that and it didn't work anymore. They didn't stay open. So that was
and today it's all done digitally.
Oh, it's all, you can't. Yeah. Well, they don't even use film anymore.
Right. It's all digital.
So
I'm just curious, how long did you do that before you turned into a manager, you were a talent manager?
while I was still learning at Salters,
Right.
I worked my way up to being a senior publicist with a secretary and an assistant, and making 150 a week. By then, I'd gotten my first apartment in the city, and I had met a singer named Thelma Carpenter, who was a former Count Basie vocalist, and she had been recording for Choral Records since the early 60s. She had one chart hit called Yes, I'm Lonesome Tonight.
Right.
And she made, finally, her contract was running out, and she made like a final album, but they were going to drop her, you know, they were dropping her at the time the album was being released. So the album was just about to come out at the same time I started working with Salters. And I met her because I went to see Kay Ballard at a club in the Village, and Thelma was on the bill. And I loved her at the club. I just loved her singing. I didn't really know who she was, but we just had like a bond, you know. We became great friends. I loved Ethel Waters, and she was a big Ethel Waters fanatic. So that was what brought us together. And so I started trying to help her with her career. And as I was learning at the Salters office, I was using all the stuff I was learning, trying to help Thelma. And all secretly, you know, on my lunch hour, I'd go down, when I wouldn't go down to get the newspapers, I would go to the phone booth in the back of the newspaper store and call up the producer of Girl Talk or the producer of whatever TV show and try to get Thelma on it. I helped get her booked in different clubs. I would send column items out under my own name, you know, and I actually got things printed.
Wow.
And Lee finally knew about it, and he would get angry, but, you know, and yell at me, but he was a screamer. He would yell about everything. But that's kind of how I learned. And she was really on the skids. She eventually took a job as a file clerk for Mott's Applesauce, Duffy Mott.
Wow.
And she got a call to, listed now a few years later. Pearl Bailey was starring in Hello Dolly at that time.
Right.
She got hired to be a Pearl Bailey standby. And Pearl was missing so many shows that they made Thelma the matinee star.
Huh.
She actually went on at night 101 times.
Wow. That's a lot.
So I went from helping her when she couldn't get a job to her becoming a file clerk, and then seeing her on stage in Hello Dolly.
Did she recognize in you that you were loyal in that way?
Oh yeah, we were very close the whole time.
And how important in that business is the sense of loyalty between manager and client?
Oh, very, very well, loyal up to a point. When I started managing, after I went on my own, I'll skip ahead. After I was on my own, I guess the first one I managed in New York after Thelma was Maxine Andrews from the Andrews Sisters.
Right.
She wanted to do, this was in the late 70s. She and her sister Patty had done the show over here on Broadway, but they weren't speaking. And after the show closed, they never worked together again, and they never spoke again. But Maxine wanted to do a solo act. And what happened was I was helping book some of the acts at a club in New York called Reno Sweeney, which is a very popular cabaret in the Village. And I got the idea, the show had closed, so I got the idea to book, I'd seen Patty Andrews on a TV show, and I got the idea to book Patty into Reno Sweeney. And Patty was the lead singer, so that was kind of obvious to go after her. So I contacted her, and I somehow got her phone number, and I spoke to her. And when she first answered the phone, she thought I was calling to get the Andrews Sisters, and she said, you know, the girls aren't together anymore. And I said, I know, I was calling to see if you would be interested. Anyway, when she heard what the money was, it was $2,500 a week, self-contained, which meant she had to pay the musicians out of the $2,500.
Mm-hmm.
She, of course, wasn't interested. Then I thought, why don't I try for Maxine? And I didn't quite know what I was getting into, because to me, Maxine was like a left shoe. I didn't know what one Andrews sister, who wasn't the lead singer, could do. But I still pursued it. And she was interested and accepted the offer. By then, I was working with Geraldine Fitzgerald already on her cabaret show. And I invited them to come see Geraldine's show, which was playing at a theater at the Roundabout, actually. And they loved her piano player, and they hired him to work with Maxine. And they created the most incredible show at Reno Sweeney. It was a smash hit. And Maxine became more popular than Patty for the rest of her life, actually.
Wow.
Her show was so successful.
So I'm curious. Okay, so we know that you've been a publicist or a press agent,
Right.
however you want to call it.
So
that's placing people in the news, basically.
Right. Well, what happened was, the more I did publicity, the more I wanted to be involved in every aspect of the career.
All right. So I'm curious, what's the difference? And there are big differences, clearly. What does a manager do? What does that job entail?
Okay, I'm going to explain the difference. An agent is someone who gets the job and takes the commission, and that once they get the job, that their job is over.
Mm-hmm.
A manager, in my mind, everybody operates differently. To me, a manager was someone who guides the direction of the career. So every job should be a stepping stone. There are many jobs you do for reputation. Geraldine actually taught me that.
Is it a little bit like playing chess? You're trying to see steps ahead?
Yes. Well, yes, that's how I operated. So obviously the money jobs you do for the money. It could be a cruise ship. It could be anything like that. A reputation job is something that may or may not pay. It'll be something you are really doing for the money. So it could be a cabaret actor. It could be something that's not really going to pay you a lot, but it'll get you the reputation, get you the good reviews, get people talking about you, build an audience. So that's kind of how I always thought. Then because of my record collecting, I always loved the older singers.
Right.
And whether I knew them personally or not, I didn't know any of them personally except for Patti Page. But somehow I got the knack of being attracted to people. I'm talking now about my perspective, not in general. A manager in general does the things I said.
Right.
They try to build the career, and every manager works differently, but most of them have a goal, and the goal is to build the artist up to the maximum height they can reach. Alan Sverdoff is a wonderful example. He managed Rosemary Clooney during her down period, and built her back up through Four Girls 4, and then as a solo attraction, and made her like a major name again. Patti Page's manager, Jack Rail, discovered her in Oklahoma when she was this chubby little singer on a local radio show in Tulsa, and slimmed her down, bleached her hair blonde, made her glamorous, and turned her into the hottest singer in the country. So that he told me in his own words that she was totally reinvented. And then he said
that's been true for a lot of big stars, hasn't it?
Yeah, he said she was a good singer, but she was totally remade. Yes, well, yeah, to a certain extent. But some of the ones that I worked with, most of the ones I worked with already did what they did, and they were already well established, but they were I hate the word has-beens, but they weren't in the public eye as much.
And so they needed someone to help to push down a
Right.
new road.
Yeah. What attracted me were people that were unique in some way. In other words, that they were originals and that they did something that nobody else did, or something that other people were copying, but they were the original. And it didn't matter really what they did, as long as they were unique. So my clients included Geraldine Fitzgerald, who was a great actress, to Mamie Van Doren, who was, a blonde sex symbol, to Yma Sumac or Anita O'Day, they were all totally different. Ruth Brown. Eartha Kitt, I guess, was one of the first. People who know Eartha Kitt, who know who she is. So there are people today that don't know who she is. But people that remember Eartha Kitt probably would be surprised that there was a time when she wasn't getting good jobs. Through Geraldine Fitzgerald, I was hired by the producer of a show called Timbuktu. This is 1978. It was a reworking of Kismet, but set in Africa with a black cast. And Jeffrey Holder, who had just done The Wiz, was directing it and designing the costumes and sets.
Right.
And it hadn't been cast yet, although they had William Marshall, who was a black Shakespearean actor, who's probably best known for Blackula.
Blackula, yeah.
He was going to play the Alfred Drake role of Haji. They had Melba Moore to play the princess and Gilbert Price to play the prince. And they hadn't cast Ludlam yet, who was the glamour character. The producer was leaning towards Frida Payne and one or two others. And Jeffrey wanted Eartha Kitt. And I loved Eartha Kitt. I didn't know her, but I'd always been a huge Eartha Kitt fan. And so I was siding with Jeffrey, and Luther thought she was too old and this is 1978. He thought she was too old or too passé. And we just kept working on him, and he finally hired her. He hired Eartha, which is important because Eartha eventually became the starring factor of the show. William Marshall was fired out of town in Philadelphia, and Eartha became the prominent name in the show, along with Melba Moore and Gilbert. When we played Washington, the show tried out in Philadelphia and Washington. And because I knew we were going to be in Washington, I got Eartha Kitt, for those who don't know, had been thrown out of the White House or blacklisted by Lyndon Johnson because she attended a White House luncheon and she spoke out against the Vietnam War. And it became a big scandal throughout the country. And Johnson called all the newspapers and club owners and various important people in the business and told the agents them he didn't want to see her on television anymore and didn't want to see her in the newspapers. And she didn't know this at the time, but while we were in Washington, Jack Anderson asked to have lunch with her. So Jack Anderson was the main political columnist for the Washington Post. Britt Hume, who some people may know better, was his assistant.
I see.
And took over the column later. Anyway, Jack Anderson wanted to have lunch with Eartha, so we had lunch. I went with her. And he handed her a copy of her dossier from the FBI.
Ooh, wow.
Which spelled all this out, that the CIA and the FBI had gone to all the club owners and the agents and said they didn't want to see her anymore. And of course, the club owners, a lot of them were mob connected, didn't want, the FBI coming around. So it affected her career. So anyway, in 78, when she was hired, and also the publicity that came out made Eartha seem like the villain. Like they made it sound like she'd gone to the White House and insulted the first lady. That's how it was portrayed in the papers. So I knew we were going to Washington. So Geraldine Fitzgerald's husband had been very active with the Jimmy Carter campaign. And he contacted the Carter people and said if there was any way, Carter was president, he said if there was any way possible, could she be invited to a White House event? And so Ford's Theater had been refurbished, and they were having a big celebration for the reopening of Ford's Theater, where Lincoln was shot, for those that don't know that. So we went to the reception, and we were on the receiving line to meet the president and first lady. And waiting our turn, we were just going through the reception line. When it got to be, people were going through the reception line, one after the other, shaking hands and, moving on. When it got close to Eartha's turn, suddenly all the cameras went on, all the lights. It was like so incredible. Wow. All these lights went on and all the cameras, were gearing up. And flash bulbs and camera lights suddenly were everywhere. And because it became a major news story. The next day, I was right behind Eartha on the line. The next day, the front pages of every newspaper in the country, and that night on every late night newscast, were big stories. Eartha Kitt welcomed back. And somehow it made audiences think it was okay to like her again. And from that time on, she got a standing ovation every show.
Did you have anything to do with arranging that?
I arranged the White House invitation.
But not the turning on of the cameras and making that
happen.
No.
That was because it was a hot story. That it was her first time back at the White House since Lady Bird.
So it wasn't a stunt to have that happen, but in fact, getting her at the White House was very useful.
I had a sense that it would be a news story. I thought her first time back at the White House would make news. I didn't know it would be that big, that would be on front pages, but I thought it would get coverage, and it did, and it was on every newscast that night.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked. Then we went to New York and opened on Broadway. And I devoted myself to Eartha, basically. I promoted Eartha. I mean, I did what I could for Melba and Gilbert, but I was enamored with Eartha Kitt. And so I really concentrated on her, and I made her the talk of New York. We went to everything. We were at every party, every event. I managed Eartha. Rita Hayworth, who was in the news because she had Alzheimer's, came to the show, and I tipped off an AP photographer who came and photographed her backstage with Eartha, which got her daughter angry, but we got the picture and it made all the papers the next day. And she looked beautiful in the photos, so that was okay. The Diabetes Association was having their dinner. I arranged for Eartha and Gilbert to speak. We timed it for the intermission. And I had it arranged. We had a car waiting, and I had it arranged so that they would hold the second act if necessary. So as soon as the first act curtain came down, we ran to the car, got over to the Waldorf. Now, Eartha and Gilbert were in costumes that were almost nude. I mean, Gilbert had like a little jockstrap thing with beads on it, and Eartha had a kind of a nude costume that was similar to like the things that Marlene Dietrich wore.
Right.
Like a see-through costume.
Right.
And we ran through very exotic makeup and a turban. And we ran through the lobby of the Waldorf into the banquet room. And they got up on stage and spoke. Then we ran back through the lobby to the car, back to the theater. And we got there before the intermission was
over. So let's talk about how you got from being a manager into producing shows, because that's a different entity entirely in terms of what you're doing in the business. How did you then become a producer?
In 1974, I went to see Geraldine Fitzgerald. Geraldine Fitzgerald, who was a dramatic actress, had been taking singing lessons because she had to sing in a Paul Newman movie called Rachel, Rachel. And that led to her putting a cabaret act together. And she was booked into Reno Sweeney, where I later worked with Maxine.
Right.
And I didn't know her, but I was intrigued by the fact that she was playing Reno Sweeney, and I went to see her show. And it was fantastic. She called it Street Songs. And when it was at the end of the show, I probably never would have spoken to her. I would have just gone home. But as I was leaving, she was sitting at a table out by the bar. There were tables, and she was sitting at a table with her husband. And so I went over to her to compliment her on the show, to tell her how wonderful it was. And I said that maybe I could help her. And she didn't have anybody that was really working with her. You know, she had her agents, but they weren't helping her cabaret act. And so she took me up on it, basically, you know, because she could use help. So the first thing I did was book her into Brothers and Sisters, which was another popular club, and where Barbara Cook got her start, her comeback start. And I started working with her. I loved it. We bonded immediately, and I loved her. I loved the show. And she said, she decided that I shouldn't be a press agent. I should be a producer. Like being a press agent wasn't a good enough profession. I should aim higher. So she said I should be a producer. So she made me producer of Street Songs. And
so it was, again, another trial by fire. No, you weren't educated in it. You weren't trained in it. You didn't go to school for it.
Just my own instincts. Yeah. Being a press agent, it started earlier with Thelma Carpenter, and then some of the people I worked with as a press agent, I ended up getting more involved with. And like Dorothy Lamour, who I met because of Hollywood Palace, was living in Baltimore and really was unconnected in the business. She'd gotten onto Hollywood Palace because Bing Crosby was host, and they wanted to have one of his old road co-stars.
Sure.
But she was living in Baltimore, didn't have anybody. I contacted her because of publicity, doing publicity for the show. I got her an agent that I knew, a theatrical agent. He got her the Hello Dolly tour, which, you know, led to her moving back to Los Angeles and resuming her career again. And I was very close to her. I helped her through all of that. So that was part of managing. Some of the stock people that I worked with when I was helming in the theaters, the shows would tour. The summer stock shows would tour. They would play like a circuit from one theater to the other. So I was handling the whole tour, basically. So Alexis Smith, who hadn't worked in a long time, was touring in a play called The Coffee Lover, which was a minor comedy, but it was being promoted as pre-Broadway. So I treated her like she was a client, and I got her the cover of the Sunday News magazine. I mean, I was getting her like major New York publicity.
Right.
For a summer stock.
As a producer or as a manager?
Well, I was helping build her career because she hadn't worked in a long time.
Right.
So I was getting her these interviews, and at one of them, she said to me, "I forgot I'm supposed to have opinions again." If they were asking her, you know, questions. Anyway, so I was like rebuilding her career in a way. And this is just before Follies. I was handling a jazz club called Hoppers, which was, everything seems to be in the Village. Anyway, Hoppers was downtown on 6th Avenue and 9th Street. And was a very large restaurant, but it had a jazz room in it. It was brand new. It had just opened. And they hired me to do the publicity for the jazz. Well, I guess for the whole restaurant, but primarily the jazz room. And one of it played pretty good jazz names, Joe Williams, Carmen McRae. They booked in Anita O'Day. This was in 78, 77. And again, I probably never would have talked to her, except I was in the club the afternoon that she was rehearsing. It was the day she was opening, and she was there rehearsing. And after the rehearsal had ended, she was sitting at a table with her drummer. And so I went over to her and introduced myself as the press agent. And again, we just clicked. It became like, you know, I just loved her. I loved her as an eccentric character. I didn't really understand the singing. I didn't understand that kind of jazz, what she was doing.
Right.
But she fascinated me. Her performing style fascinated me. And also as a person, she fascinated me. And this was right around the same time as Timbuktu. And Timbuktu went on tour. And Anita lived in Los Angeles. And when we were playing Los Angeles with Timbuktu, I reconnected with her and booked her into a club a popular club in West Hollywood called the Backlot, which was a cabaret room in a gay disco called Studio One.
Sure.
And they were playing acts that appealed to a gay audience.
Right.
Like Cheetah Rivera, Bernadette Peters, Barbara Cook, people like that, Dolores Gray. So having Anita O'Day in this gay cabaret room was unusual, to say the least. And I wanted to make it a little bit theatrical. So I had seen a TV appearance that Ruby Keeler made, where they projected the 42nd Street number from her old movie on the back of the stage, and then she broke through. It was like a paper screen.
So, all right, let's talk about Gloria Swanson. How did you get involved in Gloria Swanson's project to turn Sunset Boulevard into a musical? How did that happen?
As a collector, I had still do have a lot of rare tapes. There's like a collector circuit, you know, people trade with each other. And so I built up a large collection of various tapes. And one of them was the original demo recording that Gloria Swanson had recorded in the 50s of this musical version of Sunset Boulevard that she was trying to do. And so I knew it existed. I had the recording, so I knew about it. And when the Glenn Close Andrew Lloyd Webber production was about to open at the Schubert in Los Angeles, the LA Times did a huge feature on Andrew Lloyd Webber, saying how brilliant he was to have come up with this idea. So I wrote a letter to the Times saying that he wasn't the first, that Gloria Swanson had the idea back in the 50s, and that she had tried to get it produced. And they printed my letter.
Wow.
And a few days later, I got a phone call from Dixon Hughes, who was one of the writers, and wanted to meet me. So we made a date for lunch. And my original thought was to get his version of Sunset Boulevard open in like a small theater, and kind of get the jump on the Glenn Close production.
Right.
Open ours quickly. But then talking to him, I realized that Paramount owned it. We didn't have the rights anymore, or he didn't have the rights. But then he started telling me the story of how it got written, that he had a partner at the time who he wrote with, a lover. Might as well be frank. He had a lover at the time who was his writing partner.
Right.
And they approached Gloria Swanson originally to do a review that they had written.
And this is Richard Stapley, right?
Richard Stapley was his partner, who was an actor. They had written a musical with time as the theme, or Time, which was actually Time magazine was the theme. So it was every kind of article that would have appeared in Time magazine, but a song or sketch based on each thing. And she had been in a big flop called Nina, and had been brutalized by the critics. And so she was afraid to go back to Broadway. She was at a point in her career where she was too old for movies. She had had this big success with Sunset Boulevard, but she was really too old for movies, so there was no follow-up. And she had had a flop on Broadway, so she had nowhere to go with her career. And she said to them that the only thing she would consider would be a musical of Sunset Boulevard, which to me sounded like the most bizarre, the least successful idea you could possibly have. This was at a time of Pajama Game and Damn Yankees. And,
Yeah.
Shows like that. I mean, to do a dark thing like Sunset Boulevard. Anyway, he told me all the story, and then he told me how she got in a crush on Richard. And
meanwhile, Richard's a gay man.
Right. And he kind of worked her. With the documentary doesn't clarify that too much. He kind of took advantage of her. He led her along and did everything short of having sex with her.
Mm-hmm.
So she was getting more and more frustrated. And they did have Fryer. Robert Fryer was interested in producing it at one point. And then it kind of all fell apart. And then she didn't really have the option at Paramount. They didn't want to renew the rights. And anyway, it all fell apart. But he told me the story. And I said, well, that's it. Let's do that. Let's make that the story. Have it be Gloria Swanson and you and Richard as the characters.
The story being the story of writing the music.
The real story of how it got written, with instead of Norma Desmond, have it be Gloria Swanson.
And turn that into a musical.
That said, right, and use the songs that were written for the show. So that's what we did. Dixon was a singer-pianist who, kind of like Michael Feinstein. He was playing at the Ritz-Carlton at that time in Pasadena. And so even though he was too old to play himself, I thought the fact that he was the real person would be kind of interesting. And I was booking the Cinegrill, so I arranged for it to get a month's booking there. And
which as I recall, was a kind of a small space. It wasn't a big full-blown stage.
A cabaret room in the hotel.
Right.
It was a very popular club in LA. And so I said, I was trying to connect it with Sunset Boulevard. So I said, well, have Gloria Swanson be Gloria Swanson. You be yourself, but kind of be the William Holden character. And no, you be the Nancy Olson character. And have Richard Stapley be the William Holden character that she gets the big crush on. And I said, narrate the story, just like William Holden narrated the movie. I said, you be at the piano and accompany everything and also narrate the story of the show. So we got an actress to play Gloria Swanson. He played himself, and we got a young actor to play Richard Stapley. And we opened for a month. In the documentary, they say it wasn't successful, but actually we got some very good reviews. And it never went on from there, but we got it done. And a book came out about Gloria Swanson, a biography. Gloria Swanson never mentioned the show in her own memoir. And Dixon said it was because it wasn't successful and she didn't want to write about anything that wasn't successful.
Well, there you go.
But somebody else came along and did a biography of her. And he interviewed me for the book. And so he wrote about the show and the original production and how she wanted to do it.
And you hung on to this material or the idea?
This was like 20 years, yeah.
And what were you trying to keep getting it produced?
We did the show in '94,
right?
And it was like 20 years later, more than 20 years. No, 2004. More than 20 years later, Jeffrey Schwartz had read the book and he contacted me and wanted it. Had done a lot of documentaries and he wanted this to be his first feature. And he was trying to sell it as a feature and raise money for it, but he was having a hard time. So then he decided he would do it as a documentary. And even still, he had to raise the money, which he eventually did. It took a couple of years, but he got it made, and it opened in August at Outfest. And he made me executive producer, which was a great credit. No money, but I'm executive producer. And documentaries don't make money.
We're already all the way back to cleaning up after the elephant. What, you give up show business?
Exactly. Well, it's not I was never money motivated, and none of the things I ever did were for the money.
You did it because it was something you needed to do. It was passion.
Yeah, Geraldine, as I said earlier, Geraldine said there were money jobs. Geraldine taught me a lot. She said there were money jobs, and then jobs you did for reputation. Another line of hers was, and she said this about herself when she had to restart her career as a character actress. She said, "It's not true there's room at the top, but there's a lot of room at the bottom."
Well, isn't that true? So I've been speaking to Alan Eichler for a little more than an hour at this point, and we're going to kind of wind this thing down. I'm just wondering if you can share with us a really solid piece of advice or a tip for those who may be starting out in the industry, either as a talent manager, a publicist, or producer.
I'll say both. Well, what I said. What Geraldine said about room at the bottom, lots of room at the bottom. You start wherever you can start, like I started in the mailroom, and just keep advancing and do your job well, learn your job, and keep advancing. Don't do everything for money. Try and build your reputation. The other thing she said was aim for success, not money. If you're successful, the money will follow.
Isn't that wonderful?
That's a great thought. Also, years later, I ran into Lee Salters, I guess in the 90s or early 2000s. I ran into him at an event, and I got emotional for some reason. He was a great boss, but he was nasty and could be mean and everything. So I had mixed, memories of him. But he was number one at what he did, and I got a little bit emotional, and I went up to him. And I said, "Lee, I just want to tell you that you taught me everything I know." And he said, "I don't teach, people learn." So he threw it back. He gave the compliment back to me. So that's another, thought.
I think there's a little of both.
I think, yes, absolutely. Yeah, he did teach me, but at the same time, I learned,
Well, he can't teach someone that isn't interested in learning, and you can't learn if there's nothing to learn from. So
exactly,
it's a dance. It requires two sides.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
now I'm writing. Now I'm a writer. I compile CDs and I write the liner notes, and I'm halfway through a memoir. I've got 300 pages written.
Wow. And do you have a goal toward publication?
Well, I want to finish it.
but I mean, are you trying to get it finished by a certain date or not?
Oh, no, I'm just doing it. I kind of stopped during COVID. I should really have been working, but I had some personal problems I had to deal with, domestic problems. And so I stopped. I had a partner who was ill and passed away.
Oh, I'm
so
sorry.
I was dealing with a lot of that, but I'm getting back to it.
Well, I've been speaking to Alan Eichler for a little more than an hour, and this has just been a very fascinating review of essentially a lot of old-time Hollywood and old-time New York, for sure, and the way things were, and we know they're very different today. And I just wanted to say I'm grateful for what you have, what you've done and kept preserved and so on. And I thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all these wonderful stories.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great Story Beat episodes to you. Story Beat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.